PDFs, and it's presented by Carly Spina. Carly Spina is the head librarian, assessment and outreach at the Boston College Libraries. She holds a JD from the University of Chicago Law School, has an MLS from Simmons GSLIS, and a Master's of Ed from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. She has extensive experience working, writing, and presenting on topics related to accessibility, universal design, and services for patrons with disabilities. And Carly was the inaugural chair of LIDA's Diversity and Inclusion Committee and has also served as the leader of the ASCLA Library Services to People with Visual or Physical Disabilities that Prevent Them from Reading Standard Print interest group. She regularly teaches courses, workshops, and webinars on topics related to accessibility, universal design, and technology. And you can contact her on Twitter, where she is at Carly Spina. All right, Carly, if you want to go ahead and take it away.
So I won't be able to see the chat it ends up while I'm presenting, but I'm going to, I've asked if Amanda can sort of follow along in the chat and tell me if anyone asks any questions. But Amanda, can you just let me know if you can see my slides?
Yes, I can see them.
Perfect. Sorry about that. I just want to make sure, since I haven't used Zoom before for this. All right. So today I am going to be talking about how to create accessible PDFs. So I'm Carly Spina. Since you're not going to be able to see me, I just wanted to share a quick picture in case you ever run into me somewhere. Amanda gave me a great introduction, and we've got a lot to cover, so I'm just going to skip along and start talking about what we mean when we talk about accessibility. So I like this definition of accessibility, which is that it's the design of products, devices, services, or environments for people with disabilities. The concept of accessible design ensures both direct access, which means unassisted, and indirect access, meaning compatibility with a person's assistive technology, for example, computer screen readers. And much of what we'll be talking about today is going to be about making a PDF that will work well with assistive technologies, which is part of the reason why I like this way of thinking about accessibility. So why should we care about accessibility? I know for a lot of organizations, the reason is because of laws in your jurisdiction that require that you make things accessible. But I think it's important to keep in mind that there's also a lot of people who have visual impairments, 217 million worldwide estimate, and 36 million people worldwide who are blind. So it's not just about following the law, but it's also about making sure that you're being inclusive and making sure that you're not missing a huge part of the marketplace of ideas. And beyond people who have visual impairments, there's actually also a lot of other people who may need accessible PDFs. People with certain types of cognitive disabilities or intellectual disabilities may choose to use a screen reader. Individuals with motor disabilities that mean that they have difficulty using printed materials may also use these sorts of technologies. Individuals with short-term disabilities also often make use of accessibility features, and other print-disabled users. And in fact, recently, it's become a feature that a lot of people are using who don't have disabilities. So I'm sure many of you probably know people who use assistive tools, even though they may not think of it that way, because an increasing number of people are using the voice tools that are built into mobile devices, such as iOS devices, so that they can use their devices on a hands-free basis. And for those users as well, they're sort of starting to become power users of this technology that is an assistive device and does require that they have access to accessible materials like accessible PDFs. So that's just a little bit of a background about who we're serving here, but I also wanted to give a quick background about the accessibility principles. And these are just going to be a few of the top ones before we dive into the specifics of PDFs, but things that I think will be applicable in PDFs. So the first one is alternative text. And we're going to talk about the mechanics of how you put alternative text into PDFs later on. But right now I just want to talk about what it is and why you want to use it and how you want to use it. So As you may know, alternative text refers to the text that you put behind the scenes, not visible to a person who's visually reading the page, but it is usable by an assistive technology such as a screen reader that is reading a page to a person. And this translates visual elements on your page to text or to an alternative means that can be spoken. And this is really important because if someone's looking at your page and there is an integral element that's visual, you want to make sure that they're going to have access to that information as well and not just skip over that image when they get to it with their screen reader. So you want to also remember that that means that it's really more than just images. It's really truly any visual element. If you have a visualization, if you have other types of graphics, anything that is not text and is instead a visual element is going to need alternative text in a PDF situation. You want to make sure that you keep it short but informative. You may be used to other programs that offer the opportunity to have both an alternative text title and a larger description. That's not built into most PDF creation software, so you're going to want to make sure that you come up with something that's a relatively short piece of information about what the image is. Be sure that you focus on the key elements of the item. So this is the part that I think people often get tripped up by when it comes to alternative text. The thing you want to keep in mind is that you might have a single image, and depending on how it's being used, you may have a completely different type of alternative text that you want to use for it. So taking, for example, let's say that you want to have a picture of a painting in the middle of your article. Well, if your article or your PDF is a PDF that's a biography of the artist, then the relevant information for that particular work may be the fact that it's by the artist and when and where the artist created it. However, if it's an art history textbook that you are making a PDF of, the key elements of that image may now be techniques that are used in the picture, or where it fits in, the fact that it's a picture of a particular person or a particular type of subject matter, and where that fits in with art history. And so that might be the same exact image, but depending on the context around it, what the information that you want to pull out is different. And so what you need to think about is a person glancing at this who could see it visually, what would they be meant to take away from the image or the visual element, and how can you replicate that succinctly in text? And finally, you can indicate if an item is decorative. So if you do have content that's purely decorative, sometimes you will want to say that rather than have the screen reader get caught up in reading lots of text. You can do this by leaving it blank or by checking in a box that says that it's decorative. But you do want to make sure that you clearly indicate that so that the person doesn't just think that it's skipping over important content and not realize that they're not missing anything.
Carly, we do have a question that just came in.
Sure, go ahead.
It says, how does alt text meet the descriptive needs of complex charts and graphs, for instance, a scatter plot?
Yes, so visualizations are still extremely difficult to convert into a format that's really easily accessible to someone who's not looking at it visually. People are doing a lot of exciting things in these areas. I recently saw a demo of some software that's being worked on that turns it all into sound so that you can get the sense of rising and falling notes, for example. But that's not something that at this point we can easily build into a PDF. So I think that, again, this is going to be context specific. If you just want people to get a general trend, then that might be something that you can just say, like, the general trend. Sometimes also you might be able to accomplish some of what you want to get at through the text before or after or in the caption, because honestly, for a lot of more, depending on the context, again, if it's not an advanced visualization textbook or something, a lot of sighted audiences may also need some support in understanding what some of these complicated visualizations mean. And if it is explained in the text, that's something that will be read in the screen reader. So that can save you some of these problems. But I would say that visualizations do tend to be where you're going to get the most lengthy descriptions and the most lengthy text. And I would recommend that in those cases, you try to work with someone who created that visualization, which I know can sometimes be difficult if you're just creating a PDF of the work and you're not necessarily working directly with the creator in all situations. But if you can work with somebody who's more an expert in the visualization side of things, because it's the same question that you're trying to answer, which is what's the most key element of this item that I should be pulling out. And then if the fact of the matter is you think somebody's going to want to review the data, then the other things you can think about is, can I provide access to the data in a more accessible manner separately? So can you provide a spreadsheet that's of the data as well separately, and just have a note saying that an accessible version of the data is available elsewhere, for example. Did that answer the question, or is there any follow-up?
Robert just says these are great tips. Thanks so much.
Okay, great. So color use, this one's probably the one that at this point is most people are most familiar with, but I do want to mention it because it is an important one to keep in mind. You don't generally want to convey information that's important solely through color, because a high percentage of the population actually is colorblind. Also, things can be displayed slightly differently, and generally speaking, with PDFs in particular, if somebody prints it in black and white, it's not great. So regardless of whether you're talking about a chart or whether you're talking about more, like a check mark to indicate visual cues, you don't want to do something like this example where you're seeing just red and green to indicate yes and no, for example. Instead, you would want to make sure that you have some text that goes with that to indicate that there is a difference between these two. Another thing you can do that's common in visualizations is that you might see texture. So you might see hash marks through one of the colors and not through the other one. That's an alternative you can take. But you do always just sort of want to be looking at your use of color to make sure that you're not ending up in a situation where it's the only way you can tell information. And now this kind of goes to the question about visualizations, or it's similar. In terms of charts and tables are going to go along with that. You need to ensure that you have proper tagging, particularly to say what the column headers are and any other contextual information. And unfortunately, even if you imported it from another format to PDF, you're still going to need to confirm that those tags are correct, because they don't always import correctly. Now, this is just an overview. We're going to talk about how you actually do that a little later on. You're going to want to consider whether or not to include alt text for charts, which is what we just discussed, how you might do that. And as I mentioned, consider offering by request in a second format if that's something you can do. So, can you offer to have an Excel spreadsheet that people can request for accessibility purposes potentially? So now talking about rather than just color, but color contrast, because I think this is a common problem with PDFs. You really need to make sure that you have high contrast. So whether you're talking about a PDF of text or an image or combination, you need to make sure that there's a lot of contrast between the elements on the page. And you can see in the example on the right that this low contrast makes it much harder to read. Now, people I think generally know not to do something that's that low context when they're creating a document. But where this comes up in PDFs is it's something you'll want to check for if you're doing scans, because there may be some scans that come out in such a poor quality that they actually don't pass color contrast tests between the front and the back, and the foreground and the background, and that would also mean that they do have an accessibility problem. You can check this in an electronic environment by easily checking sort of what the hexadecimal values for the various colors are that you're encountering in your document. And there are tools you can download that'll tell you what, like the background on a poor quality scan, what hex that's registering as. And then there are tools you can run those numbers through to tell you whether it's a sufficient color contrast. There are a lot of free tools for it online, and I've recommended one in the resources section at the end of this presentation as well. But there are lots of others out there if you decide that you would prefer to look for a different one. Okay, so now I wanted to talk about a couple of the more common workflows to talk about how the issues you want to watch for work differently between the two of them. So I think that often what we're encountering, especially in a publishing situation, might be that you have an original format, whatever document type that is, and you're creating a PDF directly from the original format. And I think that this can be easier to do than some other workflows, but it can still be fraught with problems because I think people think, well, I created this great Word document and I took all this time to make sure that the Word document is completely accessible. So now when I convert it to PDF, that means it's accessible. And unfortunately, that's not the case. While the two types of documents do work together decently, they don't always maintain all the elements you need, and the elements don't always come through correctly to end up with a fully accessible PDF. Even Adobe itself recommends that if you're using their tools, that you assume that you're going to have to go back through and check if you're converting a document. So no matter what format you're coming from, unfortunately, it should be part of your workflow to check and make sure that you've maintained any of that accessibility content that you built in. An alternative to this that I recommend to people that can be helpful in certain scenarios and may not work for all of your publishing needs is to just make both formats available. And in some cases, that can be sufficient. If you have a situation where you can make multiple formats of a document available, even if it's just on an as requested basis by someone who's using an assistive device, I think that this is a good alternative to explore, not because you're then off the hook for creating an accessible PDF. I still think it's worthwhile to try to make your PDF accessible, but because everyone who uses assistive technologies, just like everyone else that you know, all of your colleagues probably have different workflows that they've developed that work for them and different suites of tools that they like to use in their daily work life. And it's the same thing with people who are using assistive technologies. Everyone has a slightly different workflow. Everyone has a favorite tool. There are a few that are dominant in the environment, but there are lots of other smaller tools that people like using. And flexibility is really one of the bywords of accessibility, and particularly when you start trying to think about it in a universal design point of view, where you're trying to just be as inclusive of all users as possible. And one of the ways that I think in publishing we can be inclusive and be adopting this universal design approach is to just offer as many file formats as possible for our project. And if that's something that you're not comfortable making fully public, it can even be sort of a line saying that for accessibility purposes, you can request other types of documents as needed. Now, the other common workflow for creating PDFs, especially in library environments, is scanning documents. This is, of course, extremely valuable. It allows us to use text in whole new ways, but it is a little bit fraught with problems for accessibility reasons because of OCR. So OCR, or optical character recognition, is a great tool that allows you to sort of take a scanned image and detect what words are in it. But quality can vary quite widely depending on the items being digitized. So, for example, a 2009 article by Rose Hawley in DLib magazine found that accuracy ranged from 71% to 98.02% for historic newspapers. That's a really huge range, first of all, obviously, but also if you think about it, if 29% of the words were incorrect when you were looking at a piece of paper, it would probably be a little hard to decipher. And if you're thinking about it in a screen reader, it's even harder in many ways to figure out what is happening. And so that can really limit the amount of accessibility when we're scanning historic documents and publishing them, unless we're making sure that we have as part of the workflow doing some sort of correction and some sort of just quality control checking. That's true even of modern materials, actually, as well, because there are times, depending on how we're doing the scans, that they can introduce a lot of errors. And OCR is still very low in quality, even for more modern items, if we're talking about non-typed content, such as handwriting, or for certain types of non-Latin scripts, such as some Indic scripts and logographic systems, so like Chinese. So this isn't to say that it can never get it right, but it can have more trouble with those. There's still research going on about what the exact accuracy rates are for those languages and trying to improve the accuracy rates for other languages. And there are some tools out there that you can use if it's an important part of your workflow to be able to work with these other languages. But it's something to keep in mind. And in fact, it doesn't even have to be languages that have different letters. In fact, even just adding in accent marks can sometimes make OCR quality go down. So you're going to want to think about when you're planning for your project, what type of text you're working from and what that means for the quality control process and timing that you need to add into your overall process to ensure that you end up with an accessible PDF that's actually readable by a screen reader. Okay, so now we're going to start actually talking about creating a PDF that's accessible using Acrobat. There are a lot of tools here, so that we are going to be looking at a lot of screenshots, but I do want to also mention that I will be putting my slides up online, so they're up online now, so you can ask me for the link, or I'm sure that Amanda will be able to share the link with people if you would like to be able to look at them after the fact, since there's a lot to take in this piece of the presentation, I'm sure. All right, so the first tool I wanted to talk about is the Accessibility Setup Assistant. Unless you're doing testing, you may not yourself use this, but I think it's important to understand how users who are using accessibility devices and assistive technologies might use Acrobat, since you're trying to design things that will work well for them. So as you may or may not know, in Adobe Acrobat, there is an accessibility setup assistant that's part of the edit menu. And if you click on it, it actually walks you through 4 screens that help you to optimize your setup to use Adobe Acrobat with assistive devices in a way that will work the best. So this will allow you to say what type of assistive technology you use. It will allow you to set up how you would like it to deal with reading order. It will allow you to override tagging or follow tagging, depending on what your preferences are and what uses you're doing. And that would mean like the way that people navigate through the document. Though you can't see it, there are tags embedded in PDFs that are somewhat similar to the tags that are used in HTML in some ways. And when you're using a screen reader, this allows you to navigate through a document almost as an outline. So for example, if there's like a header 1, header 2, header 3, that would be like the 3 levels of an outline if you were looking at an outline that you might have written for a paper. And that means that rather than having to read all of section 1, you can say, okay, section 1 is called the introduction. I don't want to read the introduction, so I'm going to skip ahead to section 2, which is the research methods section. And that's going to be a way that you can avoid reading sections that you don't want to and more quickly navigate through a document. So particularly a document that you've already used, but it's also sort of the way that you can do the equivalent of skimming a document while using a screen reader. And that's sort of that second page there on the accessibility setup assistant allows you to override the way that that's done if you would prefer to make sure that you can change the order yourself. Then you can change how things are loaded so that you can be accessing just the visible pages. Because if you keep in mind that when you're using a document, it might only load the visual pages because it can tell you're not really looking at the rest of them. But with an assistive device, depending on how you want to jump through it, particularly if you are jumping through by sections, you might want to have the entire document available to your assistive device right away. And then finally, it's got some options for how you use features that may not work well with assistive technology. So for example, the autosave feature can interfere with some types of assistive technologies, and that's something that you can also override permanently if you're going to be using it. So this gives you a little bit of a taste of what somebody who is using an assistive device might need to think about when they're first using a PDF, even if it is an accessible PDF. This accessibility setup assistant is really designed to help you use the most accessible PDFs effectively. So even if you've done everything you can, these are the sorts of problems people might encounter, and this is the sort of tools they have to try to avoid those issues. So I think if I had to pick a number one thing to convey to you from this entire session about making PDFs accessible is to think about your document security and what you actually need in order to make your document secure while still making it accessible. So as you may be familiar with, under the File section of Adobe Acrobat in Properties, you have the option to set security for your document. So this might be if you wanted to password protect the document or set other types of document security. Obviously, this can be key for certain projects. You might have to have security on a particular document. However, unfortunately, security features are one of the biggest offenders in interfering with various types of assistive technology. And so if you want to make it a PDF that's accessible, for accessibility purposes, it's best to not enable any security features. If this isn't workable for your project, there are, I would say, a couple of approaches you can take. First of all, what I understand to be the most accessible of the security features is to use the password option. If you use the password option, and which passwords protects the document, you have to be sure, however, to check a box labeled Enable Text Access for Screen Reader Devices for the Visually Impaired. Another alternative, if you don't want to take that approach, is that you can just offer the document separately in a different file format. Okay, so now that we've gone over sort of those basics, we're going to start by saying you have a document and you're trying to spot fix problems within that document. You found an issue and you want to know what to do next. So there are a few different approaches you can take here. Probably the one I would recommend the most, if this is the approach you're taking where you have issues that you know you want to fix, is to use the Action Wizard. And so the Action Wizard actually will pop up for you a list of various options. And they're just sort of actions that you can do. And this is in the Tools menu. And once this pops up in your document, you can just click Make Accessible, and it's going to pop up an even larger menu of options that sort of walks you through what the different pieces of making this document accessible are. Now, right now, I'm going to just sort of go through under Prepare, starting with under Prepare, number one, what these are. So you'll be given the option to add a document description and title, and that's so that when somebody is opening this with their screen reader, they're able to find out what it actually is, rather than like if you look up under Files to be processed at the top of this screen, you'll see that in my case, it was just called Metamorphosis and then in parens 2. So that's kind of nonsensical, and maybe I want to give it a more descriptive title that a screen reader and assistive device could interact with. It also gives you the option to set how it opens, to recognize text using OCR. So this is the point at which you could run OCR if you haven't already. You could detect form fields if you've imported something but haven't actually added in the form fields yet. Set the tab order. So this is saying that you're going to set what order content is actually read in or navigated through if people hit the tab button. Do they go from section 1 to 2, or do they go from section 1 to 4 to 3 to 2 all over the page? You also are going to want to set the language and tags, and so that's all under section 2. And then finally run a full accessibility check. And we'll look at this in more detail, but that's just to sort of give you an overview of what these options are. But now I want to highlight at the very top. So underneath where it says File to be processed, and just above where the Start button is in blue, it says Add Files. And this is one of the reasons why I wanted to start by talking about the Action Wizard. If you're doing a lot of publishing, it may be the case that it is very difficult to go document by document and go through the whole accessibility checklist. Depending on the size and types of documents that you're working with, you can add multiple files and run them all at once and get a full report, and therefore more efficiently move through your workflow if you use that feature. Having said that, I was not able to get it to work with multiple file types simultaneously. So I think you may have to add only a single type of files, like all PDFs, rather than try to simultaneously use a bunch of different types of files. Okay, so now let's look in more in depth. So I'd mentioned that you can add a description. This is sort of the point at which you can add document metadata that assistive devices may be able to access in different ways. The only one that's vital is the title. So that's really key to being able to identify the document clearly. And a lot of times, depending on how you created it, it can just be like a string of letters and numbers that maybe mean something in your workflow but are kind of meaningless to an end user. So you will want to go in and make sure that you add a title. Whether or not you want to add subject, author, and keywords is up to you. It's a little less important for accessibility, but you will want to have something that's a clear, easily human readable title to help somebody know what the document is. Next up, you'll see that it also lets you, this is the easiest place from which to set alternative text, actually. There are other ways to do it, but they're much more complicated to find and navigate through. So I would actually recommend that if you are going to have to work with images, you do it through this accessibility action wizard, and you actually just click on, if you see the highlighted in blue right here, is the set alternative text. Now, you'll see that it has automatically told me that I need to set alternative text for this image off to the left. And now I have a pop-up box. And it's a little bit small, but hopefully you can see the text right above the alt text box, right at the top of where the blue box is outlined. It says decorative figure. That's what you would check if it's purely decorative. But I would caution you not to go overboard with saying something's decorative. If a person reading the text visually and seeing that picture would have their experience added to, then you should definitely put alt text in. The only time I think of things as decorative is if, for example, like you decide to put your company logo on every single page and you don't really think that people need to pay attention to that much, but it's just part of your style guide, perhaps. That might be decorative. Or if you have a heavily designed PDF where vines are around the edge of the perimeter of the page just decoratively, that would be decorative. But if it's something where it does somehow illustrate the content, you're going to want to go ahead and make sure that you add some sort of alt text there. It can be somewhat lengthy in terms of what this will accept, but you do want to, as I mentioned earlier, keep it pithy and focused on what you're trying to say here. So for purposes of making this test document, I had just pulled some text from Kafka's Metamorphosis, and this is a picture of Kafka. So I might say, picture of Franz Kafka, who wrote the Metamorphosis. And going back to what I was saying before, in a different context, if I was trying to use this picture for fashion from this time period, I might not even mention who it was, even though it was somebody famous, and I might instead just say, man in a suit from X time period, for example.
Okay, Carly, we do have one more question that just came in.
Sure, of course.
What about running headers and footers?
Well, I think that it's a little bit context specific, which I'm sure is not a helpful answer, but because you're going to want to think about it from the point of view of what it adds visually for the person. So if it's truly a running header that's at the top of every single page, you may not want to include it. If it's something that really strongly indicates what section you're in and it would otherwise be difficult to keep track of that, I guess in some cases you might want to, or like for page numbers, you may want to include that even though it's part of your footer. But if it's something where there are other ways, like through the structure of the page, I mentioned the outline, if you do proper tagging, that you can get in other ways, then I think you could mark that as decorative.
Okay, and one more question here.
Sure.
If you have a caption under the photo that identifies what the image is, for example, Franz Kafka, do you need to repeat it in alt text or will this be read twice?
So I believe in PDFs, it will be read twice, but you're still going to want to indicate that there's an image there, because otherwise it won't be clear what that goes with, or it will simply list like the file name for this photo. Well, I guess it won't list the file name in the PDF. I'm thinking more about in web. But you're still going to want to list actually, and you don't necessarily want to make them exactly the same. And that can be a situation where you can therefore make it shorter. So if the caption says, Franz Kafka, author of Metamorphosis, you could just say in the alt text, photograph of Franz Kafka. Any other questions?
No, not right now.
Okay, great. Okay, so now the other option in the tools menu is to go to accessibility. Interestingly enough, I found that this is often, especially if you're starting off with a document that you've already created, a little bit more difficult to use to do things like setting up the alternative text. So that's why I would say you might want to use the action wizard first. But this does give you more of the full options, and it's a good way to run a full check. So let's say we are running the accessibility checker, because you're probably going to want to do this for projects pretty much always to make sure. As I mentioned, even if you've imported it from someplace else, a different file format, it still might not be perfect. So this is what's going to really run a full report and tell you any issues. And jumping back for a minute, I got to this by, in the middle of the box on the left, you'll see it says full check with a little check mark next to it. If you click on that, it's going to give you this accessibility checker options. And now you can pick to do any or all of these that you would like. And how you set this up is going to determine what you get back, but it can check quite a bit for you. So you'll see, for example, it can check that there is a document title. It can check to make sure that the text language is specified. It can check that the document has the appropriate color contrast. So a lot of the things that I'm going to show you how to fix or how to do, you can first find out if there are problems by running the checker. So it can be a good place to start, actually. Rather than trying to just go through and do it all, you can first check and see only where you need to fix problems. So then you just click Start Checking down at the bottom. And it's going to give you a little report here. First at the top, it's going to tell you the total number of issues that it found. And these include both things that it can't deal with and known problems. And it's also going to show you a list of all the things where you passed. So anywhere that you see the green check mark, you'll see that that's accessible content. Anywhere where you see the X, you'll see that that's where you failed, and it says failed. And then it will tell you things that it just can't decide for you, which is things in this case like color contrast and logical reading order. Those two are actually frequently ones that it can't deal with, almost frustratingly frequently. So just be aware that it's likely the case that you'll end up having to do more manual work on those two in particular. So let's say now that we want to fix a problem. Well, actually, they make this exceptionally easy from the accessibility checker, which is another reason why it's a good place to come rather than trying to think about each step and do it on your own. Because what you can do is you can just, on any of these where it says failed, if you right-click on it, it's going to explain the rule to you, give you the option to skip it if there's a reason you want to skip it, and give you the option to fix it. And if you fix it, if you click on the fix option, it's going to pop up what you need to do to fix that. So I didn't set my language in this case. So I click fix, and it pops up with a box, the only function of which is to allow me to set the reading language. And it even auto-detects what language it thinks it is. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, why does it matter? Why do I have to think about this? It's actually really important because it is how your screen reader is going to know what accent to read with, and it's going to know how to detect and pronounce different words. So it is worth definitely setting the reading language. And then you can see now that I've fixed it, it switches to say passed. Okay, editing tags. I think editing tags is ridiculously hidden personally, and that's why there's this huge menu open in my screenshot. You have to go to the View menu, Show Hide, Navigation panes, and then select tags in order to get to the full tag menu. Once you've gotten to that, it will pop up with something that looks like this to the left of your page that shows you all the tags. And for anyone who has worked in HTML, this might look a little bit familiar. And from here, you can then decide that you want to, for example, delete empty tags. So anything that's gotten pulled in somehow empty, you want to get rid of those so that you can make sure that screen readers doesn't start getting caught on them. You can add new tags. You can sort of manually fix any issues that you see with the tags. Okay. So now moving on to ensuring that the content is in a logical reading order, which is another thing that it said it couldn't do for us before. So the way that you set the reading order is actually a little bit tough. It's going to be one of the options that you have in the accessibility checker. So you're going to want to click on that. But then when you get to it, it's a little bit of a more complicated process than you may be expecting, because it's actually going to give you an option to draw a box. So basically with your cursor, you just highlight the part that you want, and then you indicate by clicking on it what type of content that is. So is it text? Is it a figure? Is it a form field? Is it a caption and a figure that goes with it? And that's how you can make sure that captions and their figures are associated, though people often don't manage to do that. Is it a table or a specific cell? Is it a formula? And you'll click on all of this. And then at the bottom here, you can see Show Order Panel. And once you've identified all the content, that Show Order Panel is going to give you the option to go through and set the order that you're doing. There's also a table editor. In this case, we didn't have a table, but if there was a table, that's also what will let you set up how you move through that table in an orderly fashion. Reading order is a bit complicated. It's very context specific. And unfortunately, I just didn't think that there was time to dive heavily into it today. But if you're somebody who works on documents where you have a lot of issues with complicated reading orders and you find that this is difficult, do feel free to get in touch with me separately, and I'd be happy to provide additional tips and help a little bit more with that. But it can get pretty complicated pretty quickly in certain types of documents, at least. A lot of times you're just kind of reading straight down the page, and then this is relatively easy to deal with. Accessible forms. I'm not sure how many people in a publishing setting are going to be ending up dealing with a lot of fillable PDF forms, but they can be very inaccessible if you aren't keeping accessibility in mind. So when you first are creating a form, let's say we're starting out with this. So this is going to be a mailing list. It's a document I'm in the process of creating, and I want to make it into a form. So this is the menu up at the top there that I'm going to have as I'm making forms and as I'm adding form fields. But it's really easy to make them inaccessible, because if I just click and create a form field, the field name is going to default to text 2 or text 1 or whatever the number text field I've added is. And if you go to click on all properties, the tooltip is actually going to default to blank. I've added this tooltip in. And what actually makes it accessible isn't the name, it's the tooltip. So in order to create an accessible form, you need to create the field, and then when this pops up asking you to give it a field name, feel free to give it any name you would like. You can make it required or not required, but then you also have to click on the All Properties link here and go into General and specify what the name is. That again can be anything you want, and then what the tooltip is, and that's the piece that should be descriptive. The tooltip should not only tell you what should go in that field, so in this case I put last name, though I'm now realizing it was actually first name that I'd highlighted, so that was my mistake there. But most important, it should also tell you whether or not it's required, because the way that PDFs indicate that a field is required otherwise is not accessible. So if you want somebody using an assistive device to know that a field's required, you need to put that in the tooltip, and conventionally people put that in parentheses in the tooltip. So let's say you wanted to add a radio field, for example. So when you click on, when you create a little radio button, that's what these little squares are on this page, you can right click on it then, and you'll get a whole pop-up menu of options. What you want to go to is the properties. And again, you want to fill out the tooltip just as you did for the other types of forms. But in order to make a radio button accessible, in addition to that, you also have to go to the options section. And you have to make a choice about what the radio button choice is. So if you don't fill in radio button choice, it's going to tell the screen reader contact permission, but it's never going to tell them which button is yes and which button is no, for example. So it's really important to make sure that you add in under options what the choices are. Without that text, it's going to be very difficult for somebody with an assistive device to use the form. Okay, so that's kind of what I wanted to cover today. I wanted to leave lots of times for questions, but I did just want to sort of add with this quote, which I think is a really good way of thinking about it too, which is, this is from a disability advocate named Judith Ellen Human, and she said that disability only becomes a tragedy for me when society fails to provide the things we need to lead our lives. So think about not only when you're creating accessible PDFs, are you making sure that you are following the law, but you're also making sure that the documents that you've created are available to the widest number of people, and that you're creating an inclusive environment for people who have disabilities to be able to navigate through the same resources that people who don't have disabilities can use. Here's how you can contact me if you have any questions after the fact. I'm gonna close this in a minute so that I can see the chat again. But before I did that, I also wanted to say, I have a list of resources here as well, which are some good options for finding additional information. So a lot of tools that tell you about how to go about creating and testing accessible PDFs, and also the color contrast checker that I had mentioned. So let me get out of my slides now so that I can instead see the chat. Okay. Does anybody have any additional questions you would like me to answer?
There was a comment earlier that I just want to draw to your attention. Someone wrote in, I'd love to know about making data sets accessible, though maybe that's a different conversation. Do you have any responses for that one?
I would say that making data sets is a little bit of a different conversation, because your best bet for making a data set accessible probably won't be a PDF. It probably won't be for most people, because that's going to make it a little harder to manipulate the data. But specifically for accessibility purposes, there are a lot of systems that are more accessible. Excel, or just making it a CSV document that people can work with in any tool that they want, would be a better approach, I would say, if you're talking about publishing accessible data sets. If you're talking about, you know, something that is universally accessible, CSV is probably going to be the best, I would guess. Okay, so then there's a question about what tools and websites would I recommend that we watch in the future to keep up to date on new features to aid in accessibility. So I can add a slide with some suggestions for that. One thing I would recommend is, I'm not sure if people are familiar with WebAIM. If you've ever used a tool called Wave to check web accessibility, that's made by them. But they also do a lot of really other interesting support documentation, but also surveying. So coming out soon, I think they just finished data collection, and they're supposed to be releasing pretty soon their latest survey. They do a survey every few years of people who use screen readers and other similar assistive devices, and it's a great way to keep up to date on what the most popular are. So for example, JAWS has been dominant for a really long time if you're a screen reader user, but that is starting to change slightly as there are more competitors out there, and in particular because, as you may or may not know, all iOS devices have a tool called VoiceOver built into them. And while it's not exactly the same across mobile devices and non-mobile devices, it is actually pretty similar. So people are starting to like using that because it's a single type of tool that can be used across platforms and across their devices. And I think that those sorts of things are going to change more in the future. And so their surveying is really valuable because if you're going to bother doing testing, you want to think about testing with the most popular tools and not trying to make something that's accessible with every single tool, because unfortunately, as much as we would like to do that, that's not always possible. So yes, you might want to create something and test it with several different tools, but that's one of the reasons why I often advocate for the flexibility of offering multiple options, is simply because it is really hard to make sure that you keep up with all of the different tools that people might be using. Unfortunately, they all work slightly differently. In terms of other websites and tools, as I said, can recommend some things, but if you're on Twitter or any other social media, there is a hashtag that people use, which is actually, it stands for accessibility, but it's typed A11Y. I'm going to put it in the chat. Oops, I think I just chatted that privately to Amanda by accident. So this hashtag is one that people use to share accessibility information. It's a lot of people who use assistive devices or who work in the field of accessibility, not just in libraries. So if you are on any social networks, that might be another resource that you want to check out as well. Any other questions? Okay, well, if people have questions that come to mind later, you can get in touch with me, and I should be able to just share the slides now. So I'm going to share a link to the slides in the chat box, but we'll also see if we can share it in another format as well.
Yes, we'll definitely, like I said, the presentation was recorded, including the Q&A. That will be made available, and we'll make your slides available too.
Great. And I'll add something with some suggested resources just for accessibility generally, beyond the resources I had listed originally too.
That's perfect. Thank you, Carly.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you all for attending. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Carly. This was fantastic. And thank you all for attending. And we'll please watch for announcements coming out about our next webinar.